Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon for the LandViewer and Global View webinar. We're going to give it just another minute or two for some more folks to join and then we'll get started. All right, hello everybody. Thank you again for joining us for today's corn acreage and yield webinar. Just a couple of things before we get started. If you'll note, there's a questions box underneath your slides. If at any point during the presentation you have a question or a comment, please feel free to enter it into that box and we'll answer it either at the end of the presentation or in an email separately afterwards. You will receive the slides and recording following today's presentation as well. So if there's anything that you wanted to look over again, you'll be able to do that. And lastly, you'll notice on the left-hand side of your screen, there's a survey. So if you would take a moment after today's webinar to fill that out and send us some feedback, we'd really appreciate it. And with that, I will hand it over to Stefan, who will get us started.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Can you hear me okay, Caitlin? Everybody?
You sound good?
Excellent. Okay. Well, I want to also welcome everybody to the third webinar hosted by our team this summer. We got a good program as usual. Randy will go over the observations from the ground. He has just completed his first trip around the Midwest, and he'll summarize that. In addition to that, we have our observations from our 12 crop consultants. You get the weekly crop consultant report, and Randy will integrate that report into his observations as well. Then Joshua Senecal, our meteorologist, will provide an overview of the weather this summer, an update on his projections. And then finally, as you may have anticipated, this webinar also constitutes our first look at acreage and yield for the 2015 corn crop. I want to emphasize at this point that this is just a first look. Ken will detail the methodologies behind the numbers that we will be presenting. Jonathan Fleck has developed our statistical model, and the results from his first model run are integrated into Ken's presentation. You know, it's easy. I think a lot of other analysts will come out right in line with USDA, projections at 165, 67 bushels per acre for the corn crop. However, we feel, at this point, there have been heavy rains. There's a lot of drowned out spots out there, and we've taken those into our yield projections, and will come out lower than other analysts, by tomorrow. But again, we would be remiss if we didn't point out that there's some problems out there, and our first yield assessment has therefore to be considered directional. With that, I'm passing it over to Randy, who will give us an update on the conditions on the ground. Randy, you there?
Yes. Thank you, Stefan, and good afternoon, everyone. Oops. Hit the button. Over the last couple of weeks, I took a 8-day tour of the majority of the crop, Midwest corn crop. Traveled over 3,000 miles, and also getting reports from our cooperators around the country. This slide here shows that the major areas of corn production in primarily Illinois and Iowa looks pretty good all in all. It does have its issues across the central portion of Illinois and into Iowa, but then other areas are really having the excess water issues. Southern part of Ohio looks good, but it's been getting lots of water. East Indiana, Northwest Ohio has really taken it on the chin. One of our reporters said in one county there in Northwest Ohio, there's over 100,000 acres that won't get planted now in just one county. So that area is really struggling. Through central Indiana, it is very wet, and then southern Indiana looks very good, but there's limited acres of that in that area. Coming on across here in southern Illinois, the crop is suffering. Soybeans are really struggling at this point. Many acres haven't been planted yet. So the tropical storm Bill that came out of Texas came up and just gave us an onslaught of water, and then it's just continued over the last week. And going farther north, like I said, central Illinois, most of Iowa looks pretty good. Minnesota looks very good. Its crop is a little young at this point, of course, being in the northern regions, but it does have a very good crop. Then over into northwest Iowa, it looks good also. Then traveling over into the Dakotas, I noticed in North Dakota there are very few acres of corn this year compared to the last several. But the crop that's there does look good, but it's just a lesser acres of it than they've had in the past. And then finally swinging back around to northern Illinois, it is continuing to get wet weather there. I was in that area for 4 days, and probably 70% of the corn crop there looks pretty good, and the other 30% looks atrocious. So our feeling is that those areas that have declining crop are going to make a bigger dent in the final yield at the end of the season. Going on through, we do have some reports from our out-cooperators. There's one from South Dakota. Moving on across into Minnesota, which their crop looks pretty good. Moving on to northeast Iowa, their corn is going to be tasseling here soon in the next couple of weeks. Looks pretty good. Right there in that particular area, they haven't got the onslaught of rain like we have in other parts. Then moving on to central Iowa, it's looking decent there. So and then moving on farther to southwest Iowa, it's a small crop. It's going along pretty well, or it's a young crop, but it's moving along fairly well. They haven't had the excess water there. So it's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde system we've got here at the present, that the older corn across the Corn Belt is handling the wet weather fairly well, but the younger crop is not. And we will start seeing more water issues if this wet weather continues, corn yellowing due to lack of oxygen, and just all the issues of having too much water. The bean crop will continue to suffer if we get more rain. We need some heat and dry weather to get the beans really going. They prefer a more drier, more heat intensity to make them really produce. So with that, Stefan, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Randy. Prior to the webinar here coming online, you said something interesting. How interesting? How long does it take for a corn plant to basically drown out if it's too long underwater?
Oh, if a corn plant goes underwater, the water needs to be gone within 48 hours without doing any really major damage. If it gets past 48 hours, that crop is really going to suffer, if not die. I forgot to mention that here along the rivers, St. Louis is supposed to crest Tuesday or tomorrow. It's said that the Mississippi River will crest at St. Louis tomorrow, but then you go up the Illinois, and there are a lot of sandbagging, and the Illinois is getting out at Beardstown, I understand, and so a lot of this land around these rivers is not in a safe position today.
Okay. Well, thanks for pointing that out. I actually myself drove down to Champaign on Saturday, and there's a lot. If you look across the fields, there's a lot of smaller parcels, certainly sub-acre parcels. That are where there's a lot of standing water. That's of concern.
Right.
So that's why we're pointing that out. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, is Tom? Thanks, Randy. Is Tom on the phone? Tom Renato?
Yes, I am. Mm-hmm.
Tom, excellent.
Yes.
Welcome. Hey, can you tell us a little bit about the markets, what the markets are doing?
Well, last time we did this, I kind of suggested to everybody that the market was too short, and we're going down to all these lows, and didn't want any part of it. And 3 weeks later, we developed into something that I don't think anybody anticipated, certainly not the traders. And this west versus the east phenomenon is going to be an unknown here for a while. Tomorrow's report, which is focus on stocks and acreage, I think you have to take the acreage report with a grain of salt, because those surveys that were taken in early June, and at that time farmers intended to plant everything. And we're not going to know, unless they issue a special resurvey, we're not going to know this until probably the August report. And we may not even know until we get into the fields about what's actually harvested. So your unharvested numbers may be way up at the end. Again, it'll take time to find out, as will it take time also to figure out what this excessive moisture means to overall yields. That's not something we actually know today. It's guesswork. So what does that do? Well, that just creates just more and more uncertainty. And a market that was very bearish for the right fundamental reasons have now turned around, because not only the U.S. has suffered, but our competitors, our foreign weather has become questioned. To the north of us, Canada has its own issues going on, and now we've thrown in potential with the strength of El Nino. Countries like Australia and India may end up getting in a little trouble here, and of course France is Europe, particularly France, Spain, Germany. They're suffering through a heat wave. All of this is just aggravating the entire situation here, and just leading people to say, well, what can we do next? What price level? And I'm here to tell you that regardless of what tomorrow says, until we know more about U.S. or world production, we could easily ratchet up another notch here very quickly and very quietly, just because of the uncertainty. Now, Val has been on the increase of late in front of the major report tomorrow. That should come down a little bit, but the uncertainty of the crop is going to stay with us. I'm afraid not till harvest time we're going to know more about this production, and even then you don't really know what you get in bean yields till you put them across the scale anyway. So world weather and U.S. weather has become to the forefront. While we're having these issues in the southeast that we burned a lot of that current crop up. We'll see what the ratings were, but they fell sharply last week on excessive heat during pollination. To try to get a big yield like last year seems unattainable at this moment. The question is, how low can we go, and what are these harvested or unharvested numbers going to be? So that's what I'm kind of looking at here right now. That yes, we've done a lot, but if we didn't get these acres planted, and again, there's a good chance, particularly in beans, that we didn't. We're going to find that out later. The other trouble is Randy talks about the East, how bad that is. Well, you can only imagine what these mills are trying to do, buy every pound of quality wheat, soft red wheat they can. It's the soft red wheat crop is a complete and utter mess, and that has implications also. So we have some weather issues, and weather until weather changes, you got to follow this weather very closely. And unfortunately, from at least the people I subscribe to, this pattern in the Midwest is not changing here within the next few weeks, and this world weather pattern has taken on more of importance.
Right. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I think that's a perfect segue to hand it over to Joshua Seneschal, our meteorologist. Before I do this, I want to encourage our clients to go and use our pricing mask, our elevator pricing mask on the Genscape website. You see some screenshots here. You see the more expensive corn, $4 plus per bushel in the Kansas, Oklahoma area, and the cheaper corn in North Dakota, South Dakota regions here marked in yellow and in red and yellow respectively. Again, want to encourage you to use our website. So with that, I'm turning it over to Joshua.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. All right, so I guess we'll start off kind of looking at a recap here, at least through the 24th. Actually, the two images on the right in this slide are from June 1st to June 22nd. So technically, we don't have the entire month yet, but I think we've had a pretty good picture, at least, of the weather conditions the last few weeks. And really, so far, June has been, temperature-wise, pretty seasonal. The upper Midwest has really been close to normal. We've seen slightly above normal temperatures on average the last few weeks across the southern half of the Midwest. A few areas 2 to 3 degrees above normal, especially across the southern Ohio Valley. But overall, in terms of temperatures, we've been pretty close to seasonal. The image on the far right, this is looking at growing degree days and departure from normal. And that big, that diagonal bold black line, that kind of separates above and below normal growing degree days. And so far, starting from May 1st to the present, we've actually seen below normal growing degree days across the western and upper Midwest. And we haven't seen that heat be able to work as far north as we were originally expecting. It really seems like it's been the southern and southeastern Midwest that's had those hotter temperatures, and that's where we've seen the growing degree days accelerating above normal. But we are just starting to fall behind a little bit in terms of growing degree days across the western and especially the upper Midwest. Now, in terms of precipitation, this has kind of been the big factor here. Obviously, we've seen a tremendous amount of rainfall the last few weeks focused across the central and eastern Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Much of these areas have seen close to double the normal rainfall. Some areas triple what we typically see in a typical June pattern. And really, this has obviously had some detrimental effect on the corn crop thus far. What we have seen is more favorable rainfall farther west, Iowa, Minnesota, the Dakotas. These areas have been a lot closer to normal in terms of rainfall. And as we looked at that report a few slides ago, it seems like that's the area that currently has the best crop, is the western Midwest and kind of portions of the upper Midwest. And those are areas that we saw the more reasonable rainfall. So main story in June thus far, very heavy rainfall across the central eastern Midwest. As a result of that, most of the Midwest is drought-free. 82% of the Midwest completely drought-free. And the only drought as of the June 16th drought monitor is across the far southeastern Ohio Valley. And honestly, based on the amount of rain we've seen the last few weeks, I think most of that drought's going to be completely gone. So in this next slide, we're just going to take a look at what we've seen so far in June, compare this to what we've seen last year. And overall, temperatures aren't that much different from what we saw last year. It's been a little bit cooler across Michigan and Wisconsin. Obviously, these areas don't have a lot of corn acreage, so it's not that big of a deal. But the heart of the Corn Belt overall, pretty similar year over year. Slightly above normal temperatures, no significant heat thus far. In terms of rainfall, though, it's interesting because last June we saw a tremendous amount of rain focused across the northwestern Midwest. In particular, northwest Iowa, southeast South Dakota, northeast Nebraska. These areas had tremendous amounts of rainfall. And this June, it's been farther east. Again, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, these areas have had a lot of rainfall. So we've seen that axis, that area of very heavy rain, just shifted farther east. And if you look at the graph on the bottom of the left side of the slide here, this looks a good and excellent corn trend, and this is also comparing the current year with last year. And right now we're about 3% behind in terms of good and excellent corn compared with last year, and it looks like the corn trend is starting to drop a little bit more rapidly, obviously associated with all that rainfall we've seen in the central and eastern Midwest. All right, so looking forward to the month of July, we think we're going to see some warmth across the southern and eastern Midwest, upper Midwest, western Midwest. We think it's going to end up coming close to normal in terms of temperatures. There are additional cool risks to our current forecast. Some of that heat that we're indicating in the Ohio Valley, that is questionable. We've definitely seen a bit of a cooler shift in model guidance over the last couple of weeks. Originally, we were thinking we'd see some pretty good sustained heat in the central Corn Belt. Now it looks like the focus is shifting farther south and east. So we could see some periodic heat, central southern Ohio Valley, getting into southern Illinois even. But I think overall a lot of the Midwest is going to come out close to normal. In terms of precipitation, this is going to be the major factor we're going to be tracking the next couple of weeks. We do think we're going to see some wetness persisting in the southern Ohio Valley, also into southern Illinois. These areas definitely need a break, and we think, unfortunately, we're going to see some additional rainfall here the next several weeks. More favorable, or at least more normal rainfall is going to be across the central and northern Midwest. So it looks like heading into the month of July, we're going to see the most favorable conditions lining up across the western Midwest and the upper Midwest. Some heat, occasional heat and wetness is going to persist across southeastern areas. So looking at current weather and looking at corn production, we've had a national corn condition deteriorating over the last couple of weeks. Since June 7th, we've seen good and excellent condition drop 3%. Now the image on your right, this is a bit more granular level in terms of the condition. This looks at just the corn condition changes in just the last 7 days. And obviously we've seen some pretty significant reductions in corn condition. Indiana, about a 15% drop in a single week. Missouri, 20%. Ohio, 17%. So obviously that heavy rainfall is having its impact. And it looks like in terms of the Midwest, Iowa seems to be one of the best areas, 83% good and excellent rating, and definitely a lot higher than areas farther east. And as we head throughout the month of July, overall, it looks pretty favorable. Again, we're going to see wetness persisting in the southern Ohio Valley. That's the area to watch. Elsewhere, it looks like we'll see pretty tame weather. And it looks like yield potential is going to be pretty good. I may have been a little excited when I said strong yield potential in this slide. We might not be quite strong, but overall, it looks like growing conditions are going to be pretty good the next few weeks. And then I guess we'll wrap up the weather with this last slide. This looks at rainfall compared to normal for the last 14 days. And areas where you see that yellow and red shading, that indicates areas where we've seen much above normal rainfall. And really these areas have seen greater than 6 inches normal rainfall in the last 2 weeks. And that's the area where we've seen corn condition take the biggest hit.
Well, thanks, Joshua. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to Ken, who is going to present the yield and acreage numbers for this season, our first look. We did integrate basically observations from Randy from the ground with the yield model that Jonathan Fleck developed for our first look at yield and acreage. Ken, are you there? All right.
Yes.
I'm gonna. Yeah, are you there?
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Excellent.
Okay.
All right.
So to understand what we did for our acreage assessment this time around, we did not use the higher resolution satellite imagery. I, however, put some of the high resolution satellite imagery an example of what they're seeing in these areas that have had this heavy rainfall. And also to just comment that, again, as I do every year, you know, we will do an assessment with the higher resolution using imagery from the week of July, the second week of July, to make our more detailed acreage assessments. But this gives you an example of what some of this heavy rainfall is doing, and we've had some consultants talk about yield reductions of 50, 75%. And you can see here in this image how May 11th for this area that is in the greater than 6-inch rainfall, that blue on the map is areas where we saw more than 6 inches of rainfall in the last 14 days from that map that Josh showed earlier. And you can see portion of the June 23rd imagery, there's basically a river there that wasn't there in May. All those little blue dots that may or may not be visible on your screen, but all those little blue dots are areas where there was crop, most likely, based on this region that's a very heavily cropped area, and now it's flooded. So we were able to take some of that into account with this assessment. Obviously, our July assessment with the high resolution imagery, we're going to be able to pick that out one location after another. I'll move on to the next slide. Now, with the next slide, we're looking at the imagery that we did use. Our yield assessment does not have satellite imagery in it yet. Our yield assessment is using strictly weather variables. Our acreage assessment did use Vegetation Bigger, which we see here. This is a comparison to the average Vegetation Bigger based on this satellite has been in orbit now for its 11th year. So we have a very nice historical database to compare to. And we can see all those reds in there. Those reds are basically areas where the crop growth is a couple of standard deviations below what it is on average. So we can see in some of these areas, and I zeroed in on Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, because that's where we're getting a lot of this negative information from crop consultants and others, to give you an idea of what that Vegetation Bigger map is showing. Now, when we kind of zoom in with that Landsat imagery, and I'd like to point out with the high resolution satellite imagery, I'd like to point out that, you know, once you really take an assessment of how much acreage is lost versus how much acreage is out there, it often looks worse than it is. As Randy said, you know, it has to be underwater for 48 hours. The pockets that we see, assessment, a measurement of the extent of the field, it may look like 25% of that field is underwater. When we measure it, we actually get something closer to 5% of that field being underwater. So I think that's reflected, and I'll show our acreage numbers now. I think that's reflected in the fact that we're not seeing acreage reductions in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio of 10%. We're not going to see that. I don't know, you know, if that, I think we've seen some acreage increases that may reach that level, but it's unlikely. Now, will that go down when we do our assessment with the high resolution satellite imagery? It very well could, but it may just be pockets of the state. So we will find out. But just kind of summarizing what we're seeing in our acreage forecast, it is similar to USDA. We do have a slightly lower number overall. Illinois, Indiana, down close to 4%. But Iowa about dead even. Minnesota, I believe, is pretty close to even, down slightly. So We're certainly seeing some similar numbers to USDA, but I think we're a little more pessimistic than they are, and that may have to do with the fact that we're picking up some of these acres. Now, please understand that the data that we use, we can't pull yesterday's data or today's data off of the satellite and use it, so there's a delay to this data. So again, the imagery that we used was really in mid-June, so a lot of this rainfall is probably not going to show up in that imagery. So I would certainly expect acreage to go down some in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. As I mentioned with our yields, our yield forecast is quite a bit lower than trend. We recognize that. I think everyone understands when you predict yield in late June that you've got 3 more months for that corn plant. You still have silking. You still have a lot of things to happen that can influence that yield. Again, we haven't started using the satellite imagery yet. That'll be introduced here in a couple of weeks, but directionally, we're expecting that the USDA is most likely going. I think if you look at that map that Randy had that had all the crop condition ratings by the consultants, you'll see that, compare that to last year, and everything was excellent. On this same call, talking about the fact that it's so interesting that we've had such a perfect year, and then look at this 155.5. This really isn't a bad number. This is a number we typically be content with at this time of year. So we'll certainly be new variables into the model. 3 variables out of the model, out of I think 28 total. We'll be adding variables for all that number is going to become to a final number each and every time. So Stephan, I'll hand it back to you, unless you felt like there's anything else I should cover.
No, I mean that's 2 more slides on change in acreage from 2014. I think we've people can look at that. Do you want to talk about it real quick?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. So this shows where the acreage change is, where the decline is. Dakotas are taking a decline as they have here recently. You can see that those areas in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio where we've had the heavy rain, also in southwestern Illinois, there was quite a bit of rain earlier on that have reduced numbers. So that's kind of an idea. Of course, when we go and give each assessment for your draw area, we'll look more specifically at these numbers. And I think there's one more slide for yield. So here it's also looking at yield. This is just yield. This is not comparing yield to last year. It's probably a little making comparisons to last year, but we can see where, as everyone would expect, where where we typically have large yields. We've certainly taken the model and we've done some proximity analysis with the described in ICANN. We've done some other things with the model that at this time of year, with the maturity of the model where it's at, we're seeing a lot of average information coming out there, and you can see that where we're seeing a lot of average information from the Corn Belt and the we typically have the higher yields being the greener locations, the higher yielding locations, and then the areas in Texas, further west in Dakotas being lower, as we'd expect.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Ken. And, our fully subscribed clients, obviously we've set up calls to to talk about their regional variations, calls and visits to discuss their regional variations in yield and acreage in more detail. Again, to summarize, we recognize, right, that we're taking a risk here to stay below the USDA projections as they very likely come out tomorrow. And, we also recognize that we don't want to be known, as someone once joked, as the guys who forecasted 10 out of the last 2 yield declines or yield problems, right? On the other hand, I think we're seeing some problems out there. We'll point that out. The problems that are likely move the pricing, as Tom indicated, of corn. So that's all we're doing. Our next call, end of July, where we're front running the USDA yield numbers to be released at August 12th. Will be much more reliable. We'll be speaking in much more certain terms, as we will have a full suite of satellite instruments available by then. With that, I'm pretty much done. Are there any questions at this point that we should go over?
Yeah, we had a question come in. What do our national estimates tell for number 2 yellow corn as part of the total crop and the national bushels for 2015 harvest? Can we speak to that? I meet with Rick tomorrow, and then we can go over that in a little bit more detail. Okay.
Becky, do you have any other questions?
Those are our questions.
Okay. All right, excellent. Rick, we'll talk tomorrow, and then if that's nothing else, then we'll have our next webinar probably towards the end of July. Again, much more whole new suite of satellite variables available by then. Wish everybody a good day. Thanks for joining. The recording will be available. Thanks a lot.